Well, it's 12 o'clock, so I'd like to go ahead and start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Rough Cut. My name is Julia Haggerty, and I am the interim co-director of the MSU Institute on Ecosystems, and I've been in this role for about a week. So I wanted to just thank everyone who's reached out to me for the warm welcome and encourage anyone who is interested in what's happening at the IOE to get in touch with me by email or phone. I'm really happy to connect and hear your thoughts. And before I turn it over to her to start today's meeting, I wanted to just formally acknowledge that Madison Boone, who has been a program coordinator for the IOE for a couple of years now, is stepping into a new position doing science and communication outreach within MSU. And we'll continue to collaborate with her. And we're super excited for her and her continued professional growth. I just wanted to thank Madison for everything she's been doing, including assembling these great slates of speakers for the Rough Cut. Finally, I just wanted to note that our next Rough Cut will be 2 weeks from today, and it features Badma Davchin, who's a PhD candidate in land resources and environmental sciences. She's going to talk about some of her work in Mongolia. So thanks everyone for being here, and I'll turn it over to you, Madison.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. And yeah, it's bittersweet to this do my last coordinating of the Rough Cut, but excited to join ones in the future. So I will just give a few kind of housekeeping items before I turn it over to our speakers for today. But just first, you'll notice that you have been muted upon entry into the seminar. So just a reminder to make sure that you stay muted throughout so we don't get any interference with the noise. The second thing is I guess in terms of helping with internet and bandwidth capacity and everything, if you have the option to turn off your video, I would recommend that, especially it looks like we have quite a few people joining us today, which is very exciting, but just another note kind of on the technology side of things. And then my final note is just we will, and I know Sarah and Sierra will repeat this as well, but we are going to be holding questions until the very end of the seminar, but I do encourage, you'll see your chat function. It looks like a little speech bubble throughout the presentations today. You can go ahead and just enter questions into the chat, but like I said, we are going to be holding those off until the very end after the presentations are done. And my final note is we are recording today's seminar, and that will be available on the IOE website. So I'll make sure to throw the link to where you can navigate to in the chat at the very end of the seminar, and you can share it with other folks or watch it later. So I will go ahead now and pass it over to Sarah Bates and Sierra Harris, and they will be introducing, giving a little introduction and going forward from there. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Madison. I'm Sarah Bates. I'm with the National Wildlife Federation in our regional office in Missoula, Montana. And I'm really happy to be sharing This is our second time collaborating on this Rough Cut seminar series, and we'll tell you a little bit more about how you can connect with the session that we co-hosted in the fall. We're really happy to be working with the Montana University system to help highlight the research that's underway that's informing conservation and management related to beaver restoration in Montana. I'm going to give just a brief overview of the session today and the issues that we're addressing, and then we'll move right on to our featured speakers. So the impetus for pulling this together came from an effort that's been underway for a number of years in Montana and has been organized under the umbrella of the Montana Beaver Working Group. It's a group that has formed to share information and resources about beavers and riparian restoration. This group met most recently in person early last year in February and identified priority strategies moving forward to achieve our goals. And one of those priorities was to be more collaborative and deliberate about addressing persistent questions and concerns that arise around beavers, riparian health, and interaction with other aquatic species. And in fact, Montana University researchers are important partners in doing this work And that's what we've been exploring in some of these seminars so far. So before we move into the presentations, I think it's helpful just to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say beaver restoration. To clarify, this is a wide range of activities, all of them fundamentally aimed at restoring functioning riparian habitats and stream health. In the November seminar under the Rough Cut series, we focused on beaver mimicry and looked at the interaction of beaver dams with fish and other aquatic species. Today, we're looking more at how beavers interact with stream systems and how and why we might want to expand beaver populations in Montana. What might be additional pieces of information that we need to know. So in looking at that, we have, in pursuing these strategies of restoration, we've identified questions and issues that might pose challenges to beaver restoration. And the Beaver Working Group has been taking actions fairly deliberately designed to answer these questions, to address these concerns. And university research has been taking these on in the more specialized way that researchers address these issues. One more kind of essential component of working toward beaver restoration is connecting with people and building awareness to some extent in the next generation of conservation stewards. And we are, I just want to note, even though it's not part of our university research conversation, we're engaged in a lot of activities aimed at engaging kids, their families, community groups to learn about beavers and their role in riparian and stream health. And just one example I'd like to call out is a citizen science project that's been led by the Clark Fork Coalition, the Montana Conservation Corps, in cooperation with the Forest Service, which involved evaluating beaver habitat in Lolo National Forest. And so in this case, it wasn't just building knowledge and awareness, but it was also activities that are informing management decisions in the future. So as we've mentioned, we had a seminar last November. These are the speakers that we had. It was really well received, well attended. We had a participant as far away as Slovenia at that meeting, and the recorded link remains available. I think we'll post it in the comments, but it's also in the announcement to this on the Institute of Ecosystems website. So I'd encourage anyone who didn't get to see part one to go back and take a look at that. But let's move on to today's speakers. We have two really wonderful speakers today to share their experience and perspectives. First, we're going to hear from Rebekah Levine from the University of Montana Western in Dillon. She's a professor and a geomorphologist who Ben Goldfarb, in his book Eager, described as a gifted teacher with a knack for interpreting landscapes. And in fact, I've seen her in action. She really helps us see the stories that help us understand what's happened in the past around stream systems, and especially the historic role of beavers. After Rebekah, we'll hear from Tori Ritter, who's a non-game biologist working with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, based in Missoula. Tori, prior to joining FWP, did his work at Montana State University, did his graduate work focusing on beaver dispersal and habitat selection in the Upper Madison and Gallatin River basins. I sort of see Tori as a master beaver ambassador. He's a great communicator, and anybody that isn't following Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on Facebook and seeing his Tuesdays with Tori, I'd recommend that you do so. He's also been just a great partner to organizations like ours, and he continues his deep commitment to research and evidence-based management decisions, which he'll be describing today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, turn this over to Rebekah to take it from here. Thank you.
All right, let's see. All good? Everyone can see that?
It looks good.
Perfect. Okay, well, thanks so much, Sarah, for that great introduction. Thinking about all the other speakers that have come before me, I'm going to take a little different tack, and I'm going to be talking today about natural beaver systems and how we can use these natural beaver systems to think a little bit more about what Sarah was talking about, the priority one for the Montana Beaver Working Group, to scale up restoration design, to think about the whole system rather than just thinking about one dam site in one location on the river. Let's see, hold on a second. Okay, so because today what I'm focused on a lot is looking beyond these super charismatic structures that we all love about dams and all the great work that they do that Sarah highlighted a little bit. A lot of this work I've been doing in Southwest Montana, some of it with my collaborator Grant Meyer, others of it with great people across Southwest Montana, including the students at the University of Montana Western, and most recently, my great undergrad thesis student, Megan Tarmichael. So thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody who supports super cool science across Montana. When we're thinking about this, or really want to think beyond the dam, we want to think over the whole stream system and over time. So to study a whole system, let's take a quick look about what systems we're talking about here. We're spending time here in Southwest Montana and at the High Divide region. The big thing that we're interested in here is looking at relatively undisturbed settings to understand what beavers really do in their natural habitat. We looked across these natural systems at a range of basin areas and a range of peak flows, just so that we could get a sense, what are these systems like? In this talk today, I'll be comparing a little bit to these other stream systems, but I'll be focused mostly here on Odell Creek at Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge in the Centennial Valley of Montana. So this is our spatial scale. Now we're going to move to the deep time to think about beavers across time. So these are beaver chewed willow sticks. You can see that they're beaver chewed. Maybe you can see from however far away you are today that we have these distinct angles that these sticks are cut at, which tells us that the beavers were here. They were here in the past. And these go back a ways back, almost 6,000 years along Odell Creek. But when I found these things, I was like, oh my gosh, maybe they're just sticks from yesterday. Luckily, they were not. They told a much more interesting story going back into the deep past. But what I wondered when I found these things is, what did these cuttings represent, actually? What were they? That was my big question. And here is what I was up against. This in the background here shows an elevation map of Odell Creek, and every single one of these stars that's shown here represents a site where I found these paleo cuttings, these old beaver cutting deposits in the stream bank. And the numbers beside them show the radiocarbon age. We're not going to focus on that too much. The big thing is that these things were very common. However, I had a little bit of a problem because we have 5 active dams in 10.5 kilometers of stream on Odell Creek. And these dams breach with a frequency of between 1 and 5 years. So if these things are breaking and the sticks are running downstream, how likely is it that I'm getting the dam preserved, that we're getting these old dams preserved in the stream banks in perpetuity? What is going on here? So here was my original hypothesis. What I thought is that we had, hey, there's these dams and they get abandoned, and then it fills up with sediment, right? And there we have a preserved deposit. But I wasn't very satisfied with this because they were so common, and it didn't seem like this was actually happening in the world of today. So I was a little frustrated, and I was having lunch, and I laid down on the riverbank because I didn't know what else to do. And I realized that I was real uncomfortable because what I was laying on top of was all of these beaver cuttings. They were across the entire point bar. Huh. Now I was like, well, was this just some sort of fluke? Turns out that I've been walking by point bars covered in beaver sticks the entire time I've been working on this project. 81% of the point bars were covered with these beaver cuttings. And this was not a very likely explanation, but this over here with these accumulated sticks seemed like a very likely explanation. So you're going to say now, hey, Becca, great, you took a nap on some beaver sticks. Cool, they're common. So what? What does that mean for beaver restoration? Well, it turns out that these cut willow stems have a cool superpower. And this cool superpower is that they can regenerate when they land on wet, sandy sediment. They also carry along their own supplies of water and energy to allow them to resprout. The other cool thing is year-round dispersal, and they can travel really far downstream. So compare that to seed dispersal, which is the other way that we have willows being regenerated. These have wide dispersal. They happen during a very specific time of year. They're maybe successful, maybe not, 10 to 20% survival. This is the predominant way that we get dispersal, but it is not. But this propagule method is a secondary way of generating stems or generating new willows. But you might say, well, I've spent a lot of time on rivers and I know another thing about willows. This other thing about willows is that they're extremely flexible. You hang out by a riverbank and these things just bend right over. No big deal with massive flooding and massive spring flows, right? That's what happens. So how do we get this other method of regeneration to really go? Well, our favorite bucktooth mammal to the rescue. If we have the whole system full of these bucktooth beavers who are chewing away at these willows, we have a propagule generator. We have a way to send all of these sticks going downriver. And it turns out that beavers are very messy builders. Here's a stick pile that headed downstream from this dam that they were working on up here. And they're all going down, and they're going to continue moving downriver. So we have a great generator of these propagules here. Okay, so if we want to think about the whole system, so what? Now we have these two methods of regeneration. What happens is we get these cuttings getting accumulated here on the point bar, and then they start to sprout, and we get this regeneration of willows. We get rooting of these willows. So we're actually reinforcing the bank. We're adding roughness to the channel, which means that we also are adding dynamism to the channel. We're probably getting more migration here as we accumulate more sediment. And both seed and propagules are benefiting from this as we get more sediment accumulation. They both need fine, sandy, wet sediment for regeneration. And so we get that when we add sediment to the channel banks here. So what implications does that have? That means that we're adding to floodplain development, and we are likely getting more places to store that groundwater that Sarah talked about. We also are getting carbon storage as we're burying all of this riparian vegetation in these sediments. And most importantly, we're getting a really dynamic system that's allowing these willows to be very successful, which, as many of us here on this call know, is critical to species across the western United States, because the majority of our critters depend on this riparian habitat for some portion of their life history. Okay, so we can add even a little bit more to that if we're thinking, right? We talked about this spatial scale. Let's keep thinking about the spatial scale. Let's also keep thinking about the time scale that these dams are in place. We get a little bit more of this beaver willow cycle thing going on, where we have the beavers chewing the sticks. They're floating downriver. They're accumulating on point bars. They're sprouting. But we also get these dams that are being breached and built and breached and built. And in some sections, we don't have any dams. So the damming status of a section is changing over time, which means that we're getting this big mosaic of habitats across the river system over time. And so we have all these willows in different stages of succession. Okay, so then if we think even bigger time scales, so we're going to look at two different time scales just for a second to wrap up here. We're going to be looking at short time scales that are a little longer than the life of a dam, and then longer time scales, so decadal time scales and then millennial time scales. And at the short time scales, I did this work with my undergrad thesis student, Megan Tarmichael. She was looking at whether the dam was affecting migration rate by comparing aerial photos. And what we found here, if we look at just this part, what we found here is that the dam and the status of the dam did not matter as much as the period of time that this was occurring in. So whether it was dammed or not dammed, over what period of time, wasn't a significant factor in migration rate. What did matter, and what mattered a lot, was the hydrology of the system. From 1995 to 2009, we had some monster floods. From 2009 to 2018, we didn't have that same hydrology, and so we didn't get the same migration. So although beavers may affect migration rate, we still need to work more on this. We do not see that they can affect these larger scale processes. And we see a similar thing at these much longer time scales, where we're looking at those beaver chewed sticks across huge periods of time, and where we have some of these gaps in the record here through time. A lot of those were controlled, especially when we look at sites in Yellowstone that were a lot smaller streams. That was controlled by climate, so that the beavers are going up and down with climate, if there's water or if there's not water. And one small complexity here is that if we have sites that have just a little bit more water, like our Centennial Valley streams, here's Odell Creek, that's coming out of a north-facing mountain range, that site is actually helping to give this area a little bit more water, allows it to buffer some of those climate systems. But overall, still, the beavers are really along for the hydrologic ride here. They're a smaller part at a smaller scale, having an effect on these stream systems that are controlled by these much larger scale processes. So here's the summary, or two-sentence summary, so you can read that. And here are a couple questions just to wrap up that I think come out of this work and I think are really important to consider. Why are beaver streams considered good? Is it because of the dam, or is it because of this full process that we just talked about today? Do we get there with just the dam, or do we need to do more work to get these streams that we imagine? What are the restoration goals for your project and at what scale? We need to think about time and space scales as we're approaching these projects. And if we're using Beaver or Beaver mimicry, we really need to think through this clearly and think about site controls and the limits of our hydrology. So thank you very much for spending time with us today and all these awesome people that have supported this great science over time. And now I think our next speaker, who will be able to talk about actually how we take some of this information and put it on the ground, is Tori Ritter. So thanks, everybody, and welcome, Tori.
All right. Thanks, Rebekah. Is that showing up?
It looks good.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for having me. I kind of see my role here as sort of taking what we've seen in these past two series and blowing it up and taking a more big picture view and really focusing on how this research translates into better understanding the where, when, how, why to do these types of projects across the landscape. So before I get right into that, I do just want to acknowledge that beavers are an extremely powerful force on the landscape. Their impact to streams and riparian areas is really only rivaled by humans and geologic forces in terms of the level of impact they can have. Now, that same ecosystem engineering capability also means that they can cause a lot of damage very quickly if they get into the wrong situation. Now, you combine all that with the fact that they're also very highly adaptable. They can move into a lot of different systems, and that they like to be in these riparian areas where we have a lot of human infrastructure, and it becomes this very complex web of interacting factors, all kind of dictating where, when, and how to do these restoration projects. So fortunately, the type of research we've been hearing about helps make that complex web a little bit easier to tease apart. So just to kind of recap what we've learned, we heard from Jamie McEvoy, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, about public perception around beaver dams, beavers and streams, beaver dam analogs especially, the difference between amenity ranches and traditional ranches, and the importance of communicating really well with landowners that are involved in these projects. And then we heard also a little bit about permitting for these types of projects. Now, the big takeaway message I got from that is that these types of projects, when and where and how to do them, really depends not only on the landowner whose property you're working on, but because this type of restoration is meant to perpetuate along the stream, it also very much depends on their neighbors. So that's kind of a social aspect of beaver restoration. Then we heard from Andrew Bobst on the impacts of beaver dam analogs on groundwater levels, base flows, and especially highlighting that there's some potential differences between losing and gaining streams about what you can expect to get from these type of restoration. And what I heard from Andrew is that geomorphic context is a huge, huge part of not only what we can expect from beaver restoration, but how successful beavers may be in an area. So kind of the abiotic components of this type of restoration. And then we heard from Andrew Lahr, really focused on impacts to trout, both positive and negative, and the potential for beaver mediated habitats to potentially favor some species over another. And that really focused in on these projects are going to depend on what other organisms and habitats may be affected, so that biotic aspect. And then, of course, we just heard from Rebekah, and I really, really like the message she gave that it's about an entire system. A stream section that has beavers is much, much different than a stream section that doesn't. And in fact, a whole stream or a whole drainage is a much, much different system when beavers are there versus not. So it really depends on accounting for and thinking about that entire stream system. And that transitions into this term that I kind of use for the title of my talk, which is this idea of reading the beaver landscape. And what that means is just taking all of those complex factors and looking at a potential restoration site or potential landowner, potential section of stream, and figuring out what's the most efficient, the best method to use in this area. So I figured I should probably come up with an actual definition for reading the beaver landscape. And what I came up with is the idea of interpreting the potential advantages and consequences of beaver restoration, again, that umbrella term, beaver restoration, given the social, abiotic, and biotic context under which that restoration will take place. And so for the rest of my time here, I really just want to focus in on those three aspects and show how this kind of research sort of feeds into this idea of better being able to read the landscape in the context of beavers. So on that social side, Jamie and her students really focus on this idea of being able to communicate not only what you can expect in terms of benefits from beaver restoration activities, but really catering that message to the type of landowner you're working with. So on more traditional ranches, you may be focusing more on water resiliency, water storage on the landscape, green forage late in the year, those sorts of things. Whereas with an amenity ranch or some other types of landowners, it may be about that wildlife habitat, and restoring the stream back to a previous condition, creating good trout habitat. But it also really depends on the layout of the land of landowners on the landscape. So this is the Flying D Ranch on the screen right now in gold. That's all one landowner. They own entire streams entirely to themselves on that ranch. So the options for beaver restoration on a site like this are obviously going to be much, much different than a place like Chimney Creek, which is a small strip of stream that's owned by a homeowners association. And it's just a section of the stream among a much larger section of the stream, and it's got so many landowners around it that it becomes very, very complex to get everybody on board with the idea of beaver restoration. And I realize that those are two very big extremes, but it's just an acknowledgement of the fact that there's going to be everything in between, and that communication with landowners who own the property where the restoration is going to take place is just as important as communication with landowners up and downstream. And a lot of that focuses, again, on communicating potential benefits, how long it might take those benefits to come about. I thought Andrew Bob's work was really interesting, that 3 years after restoration, they were still seeing, the stream still hadn't really caught up to those beaver dam analogs yet. So it may take a while for those impacts to come about. But really also focusing on this conflict resolution part, that if you're going to get beavers into a system, even if you don't count on them being there, you really need to look ahead and see where might there be conflict situations and have some system in place to help people deal with those conflict situations. Moving on to that abiotic context, Andrew Bob's work really highlighted to me the importance of the valley context. So not only the substrate within the stream channel itself, but also the substrate within the floodplain, the stream gradient, the valley width, what tree species or what plant species are there, are they big enough for the stream channel, all those sorts of things really come into play and will have a major impact not only on the success of the restoration project itself, but whether or not the beavers are going to be able to form self-sustaining colonies that can expand outwards and move around over time. One of the biggest geomorphic issues is the level of stream incision. This is a beaver dam in Spotted Dog Creek on the Spotted Dog WMA. It looks great from the photo, but what I see right here is a very unstable situation that is unlikely to lead to long-term benefits. You can see the drastic difference between the stream bed elevation upstream and downstream of the dam. If that dam degrades, that stream is almost certainly going to reincise back through all that sediment that's built up behind it. And if you go upstream of this dam, even though that dam is almost 6 feet tall, it's still not pushing any water out onto the floodplain. And that is a big sort of threshold for beavers and beaver dams, whether or not they push water on the floodplain. If that water can escape a little bit, that dam has a much higher probability of surviving runoff periods because not all the water pressure is acting on that dam. So you compare this situation to something like this, and I'm cheating a little bit here because this is during high water, but even during low water, this dam still has channels going around it. And that relieves pressure on the dam, it reconnects the stream to the floodplain, and it allows beavers to be much more successful in an area. And if you're not using beavers, if you're just using beaver dam analogs, it takes a lot less input to get, to perpetuate that restoration action forward when you have a stream that's connected to the floodplain with these dams in place. So moving on to that biotic context, this is really focusing on the impacts of beavers and beaver activity and BDAs to fish and wildlife species, which is always a part of, MIPA and NEPA processes and getting permits and all that. You really need to be able to demonstrate that it's not going to have adverse impacts. So I'm a non-game biologist, and I feel pretty confident saying that there aren't any species in Montana where we're worried about beaver activity causing significant negative impacts to those species at a population level. And in fact, the reason I spend so much time on beavers in my job, even though I'm a non-game wildlife biologist and beavers are a fur bearer, is that their habitats provide such great resources for a whole range of species. And when you're having to deal with 300 plus species on the landscape, any sort of restoration action that applies to a lot of them at once is low-hanging fruit and kind of the gold standard we want to go for. So on the non-game side, I feel pretty confident saying that until somebody can show me some good research that shows adverse impacts to game animals of beaver activity. I'm also feeling pretty confident in saying that for the most part, the type of beaver restoration work that will be going on in Montana will either not affect or have positive impacts to game species as well. And I know there are some studies out there that showed competition between moose and beavers in areas, but overall, I don't think you're going to have a project stymied by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks because it might potentially impact game species. Now, the fishery side is much different, and that's where Andrew Lahr's work comes in, showing that there's a lot of considerations that need to be made for fisheries. And this is especially true for native cutthroat trout species and bull trout, because those species are now range restricted, meaning they don't have the spawning grounds and cold, clear water that they used to have when they were evolving on the landscape of beavers. So now, if beavers get into a wrong situation, like an incised channel in bull trout habitat, they can create a spawning barrier that's enough to cause potentially a negative impact to that species at a population level. So if you're in the range of those native trout species, it really takes a lot of consideration as to whether or not the benefits of beaver activity and the benefits of beaver type restoration will offset the potential impacts to those fish species. And I see I'm running behind here, but I do just want to mention that beavers are also part of this biotic context. You need to know what the beaver population in an area is doing to know how your restoration action is going to be influenced by the existence of those beavers. Are they going to disperse into the area? Are there sections of stream between beaver colonies that you could use some help? All that can really be illuminated by knowing where you have beavers in the drainage. So I did just make it sound like it's very, very complicated and untenable to read the beaver landscape, but there are great tools out there that have been developed and are being developed to make this a lot easier. One of them being the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, which is basically a map of potential dam density or the potential for beavers to occupy different areas. So you can really start to focus in on the best locations for beaver restoration projects. But this tool is very, very helpful if you also have beaver surveys. Unfortunately, beavers are one of the few species you can reliably survey for just from aerial imagery. So you can cover a whole drainage in a few hours on Google Earth. And then you can start to look at, of the modeled good beaver habitat, how much is actually being filled up by existing beaver colonies. And that really narrows down the reaches of stream that you want to work on, or that you could work on. There's also resources like the Beaver Restoration Guidebook, which is kind of the first resource I always point people towards when they're asking about beaver restoration. There's the low-tech process-based restoration manual, which focuses a lot more on BDAs, post-assisted log structures, and especially that geomorphic context for this kind of stuff. And then at FWP, we're working on a couple documents, including a white paper that's going to focus on those fish and wildlife impacts that people need to be concerned about. And then me and a couple other biologists are also working on a guide towards this idea of reading the beaver landscape, actual sort of step-by-step protocols for using these tools to effectively focus this type of restoration, look for those low-hanging fruit opportunities. And then finally, I always want to come back to this non-lethal management, this idea of dealing with conflict issues with beavers. The BRAT model can also illuminate where there may be conflict situations, but there's also great trainings and stuff online. I always point people to the Beaver Institute, which is a great resource, comprehensive resource on this non-lethal conflict management. And then you can also just Google Clark Fork Coalition Beaver, and it'll take you to a page that the Clark Fork Coalition has put together. And they're kind of on the front lines of this non-lethal management stuff in Montana. And there's lots of great resources there as well. So with that, I will end very quickly, but always feel free to reach out. I love talking about beavers, and I am available at all times to talk about them, and you will hear back from me because I am a little bit over the top obsessed with beavers. So thank you for your time, and I will turn it back over to Sierra.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Tori and Rebekah. That was really, really great. I mean, it was great, informative, and it was also wonderful how we were able to tie our previous presentation together. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes, I think just put it into presenter or
Yes.
stream.
Thank you. Get that part here. All right, there we go. All right, so once again, both of these talks really tied together nicely how research collaboration is happening across Montana. And there are a lot of different organizations and agencies that are doing riparian management, beaver restoration, actual beaver work. So it's been really fun to sort of tie all of it together with these two talks. And again, this is not a complete list, but this is just a list of some of the ones that are sort of out there getting things done on the ground right now. And so at this time, so we don't hold up many more things, I wanted to let you guys know that enter questions into the chat box, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, I believe you can do that. And we'll take questions at this time, and I will help moderate those. Sorry, I am having a moment here because I cannot find where my questions ended up. Okay. Sarah, if you can see the questions, would you mind go ahead and get started while I try and pull those up? Right now, I cannot see them on my screen.
Sure, there's a chat function.
Yeah.
And that's where I've been entering some resources for people, and that's where people can ask questions.
Yeah, I could see them before, but right now it's not visible. So go ahead. If you can see them now, I will work on finding them. Thank you.
Fine. Becca, I was wondering if you had any thoughts prompted by what Tori shared here, if you had any follow-up. And then we do have a couple of questions here. We have a question about, Tori, do you see the questions in the chat? There's a question about the legality and the rules around trapping beaver in Montana. Do you want to answer that?
Yes, trapping beavers is legal in Montana. There's a long season on them, and then there's some off-season dates where you can also kill them if they're kill them or trap them out if they're causing damage issues related to irrigation infrastructure. But yes, it is a managed species for trapping in Montana.
Okay. I can see questions.
Great.
Well, I mean, I can. I don't know specifically. Did you have a specific thing that you were thinking about, Sarah?
Nope. Just wondering if you had any follow-up based on what Tori put out there, based on messing around in streams.
Yeah. No, I think it's just good. I think what Tori was saying about site, that your site matters so much, and that you really have to think about the geomorphology and the long-term history of that landscape. So I think it's pretty consistent with what I was saying, but I think it's so easy for us to be blind to the other things that beavers do if we're always, oh, the dam. And I think that's sometimes the danger, right? So like that we think that they do all this big work it can be across a big range of areas. So, yeah.
Great. We have a question from Lance McNew. If you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So my question is either for Tori or Sarah. So in other realms for conservation delivery, we've tried to establish some sort of decision support tools for allocating resources or identifying the most bang for the buck stretches of habitat to restore or conserve. I'm thinking about the geospatial decision support tools that are available for like CRP and for the Lesser Prairie Chicken Initiative to identify ranches to provide incentivizing habitat restoration. Is a similar tool developed for Montana or anywhere else, a similar decision support tool that could be used? So, Tori mentioned you have the biology, you have the geophysics to identify, and the social ecological perspectives that can be overlaid to identify bang to buck restoration efforts. I'm just curious if something like that is available or in development. Thank you.
So I would say the BRAT model is probably the closest to that because it does combine sort of intrinsically suitable habitat with the potential for conflict. And then there are some resources within like the Beaver Restoration Guidebook that are kind of these matrices for deciding based on a bunch of different factors where and when this type of restoration might be or should be best allocated or used. The big problem with beavers is that geomorphic context is very hard to model geospatially, especially like the level of incision and the substrate type around the stream and the available vegetation. That part is very hard to model at scale. So there's always this need to get on the ground and see those very specific aspects. But I think the combination of the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool and some cursory beaver surveys gets you to the point of narrowing in enough to make that eventual trip to the field much more efficient. Does that answer your question? You look disappointed.
All right. So, thank you, Tori. Rebekah, the question for you from Adam Sigler is, are there observations that a casual observer could make in sediment deposits to get insights about beaver activity history in a watershed?
That's a great question, Adam. But I think one thing is that you could actually just start looking. You could just start looking for those deposits that I've been finding in the stream bank. I think it's something that you might just not notice at first until you're clued in to looking for them. And I think it would be awesome if people, while they're out there walking, are starting to mark these. Hey, where are these? Could we do something across Montana, looking for some more of these to get a sense, climate through time. I think the beaver cuttings are telling us some really interesting information, because if there's willows that are being cut by beaver, that tells us that there must have been solid riparian habitat in that area during that particular period of time. Because with radiocarbon dating, we're dating the precise age of death of that thing, and the thing that killed that willow was the beaver. So it's a really neat tool, because we can really get exactly at a beaver must have been here right now, whatever your date is that you're getting off those cuttings. I think the other thing is that you will get a lot more patchiness in the sediment accumulation along river corridors when you have beaver in there, because they're changing base level along the stream as their dams are there, and then they breach, and then they're there, and then they breach. And it's not going to be these consistent like flood deposits across a big area. The flood deposits are going to be little patchy flood deposits from where the beaver dams actually were. So what I found in looking at active sites is that what increased in elevation following a dam breach is not the riverbed. The riverbed did not increase very much in elevation. The stream bank goes up, though, because because right, you had this overbank flow, and then that deposition is left behind even as the river moves the sediment that's in the channel. Some of that is size dependent on the river itself and the stream power of the channel. So you have to consider all those things. But does that answer your question, Adam?
It does, yeah. That's very cool. Very engaging presentation of that concept. Nice work.
Cool. Thanks, Adam.
Cool. Next question. So what population data is available with regard to particular watersheds to assist organizations with initial baseline surveys?
Is that referring to beaver population data?
That's a question from Brad. Brad, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, just curious on if there's any baseline data as far as connecting dots where there are stable populations, where there's gaps within that.
Okay. Yeah, we do have. It's kind of a patchwork across the state. We do have, like I've done a lot of aerial imagery surveys here in Region 2, and we've done on-the-ground surveys and quite a few drainages in Region 3. But in terms of statewide, it's just very patchy on where there's been interest in beaver restoration in certain drainages that we have some good information on populations. And that is all stored through the Montana Natural Heritage Program, have a lot of those data in there. So like Upper Gallatin, Upper Madison, Rob Ledford and Blacktail WMAs, and then again, a lot of places in Region 2. But there is the same group that puts out the low-tech process-based restoration manual. They have done aerial imagery beaver dam surveys across entire states. So I think they've done Utah, Idaho, and the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem all have comprehensive beaver dam databases for those areas that have been done by that crew. So there have been talks about getting that done from Montana. I'm not sure what the status of that is yet, but it would be very valuable to get that done.
Yeah, and Tori, do you have a link? Do you have a link for some of those resources that you could post? Because that'd be great.
Yes, I don't know if the data being stored in the National Heritage Program is available to everyone. I don't know what level they're using, but it is mtnhp.org. And if you need access to that type of information and it's not available on there, I can check right after this. But if you need access to it, please feel free to get a hold of me and I can get that to you.
All right.
Thank you.
This next question's a little longer, and I think it could probably be answered by either Rebekah or Tori. It says, in the biota, Tori talked about things that weren't plants, but it seems in light of the willow cuttings that changes in plant biota is a really important action of beaver. So what are the implications of downstream willow, et cetera, even if the immediate area of beaver restoration seems to not be doing much?
I can start, Tori, unless you have an immediate thought.
Yeah, go ahead and then I'll add just a little thing at the end there.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. There you could say, okay, well, gosh, is my restoration having an effect, right? And I think one of the keys here is to think about some of the messiness in the system and the stability of the system. I think, and Tori talked about this a little bit, if there's too much stability, you're not getting the movement of the stream back and forth. And so you're not getting areas where there's sediment that's right for willows to really go. And so you need a little bit of banging back and forth of the river in order to get a nice point bar sedimentation going. So it might take a little bit to get that started. But then even if your structures fail, I think failure is a great thing in beaver restoration. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think it's an awesome thing because if these things fail, especially if they're made out of these natural materials, we can get this willow regen downstream, and it much more mimics how beaver really work in the stream system. So I think some messiness in this is excellent.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I did have a section in there about plants, but I was running over and that something had to get cut. And I don't know enough about some of the sort of like species of concern plants in the state that may be impacted by beavers. But there is there is some concern with some of these pocket wetlands in the western part of the state. There's some really rare plant species in some of these areas, and there is the potential if beavers could come in and dam some of those wetlands that they would kind of flood out those small patches of habitat that have those rare plant species. But another thing I wanted to mention is I see a lot of the situation where there's a stream channel and there's a narrow strip of willows running right along it, and people really want to put BDAs in there and bring beavers in there to get a huge willow fan out of it. And I think it's another one of those really unstable situations, because willows will die if they're inundated for a long period. And so if you put a bunch of dams in and that's all you have for willow are those ones right along the bank, they could die within a few years because they've been inundated. And if you don't have good floodplain connection, if you don't have other plantings going on, if you don't have that sort of dynamic processes that Rebekah was just talking about, you could actually end up in a worse situation where you lost the strip of plants that you did have. So again, it's all just really depends on that geomorphic context and how the stream is going to react to those beaver dams.
Cool. All right, Tori, looks like we have one final question for you. It says, are beaver dispersal limited in Montana? If communities embrace them, could translocation accelerate beaver restoration? And that's from Nathan Corp.
That's a good question. So beaver dispersal is limited in certain areas. Overall, beavers are really, really good at dispersing. That's what a lot of the research I did with Lansing New was about. And we had beavers going through 9 miles of terrible habitat, climbing up, rocky, bouldery sections of stream to get to these mountain meadows that are out in the middle of nowhere. So they are very capable dispersers, but I think one of the big questions is, if you want to use beaver dam analogs to help improve an area and sort of get it headed towards a situation where beavers could occupy it, there may be a disconnect between the amount of times your structures will last and whether or not beavers will disperse into that area. Because even though they can disperse very far, that doesn't mean they're constantly doing that. And if you put in some attractive structures in an area, they're going to show up the next year and occupy it. So I think overall, the idea of translocation is, I don't think there's as many situations in the state where translocation is necessary as some folks might think or believe. I think a lot of what we're seeing are habitats for beavers that are just on the edge of being occupiable, and occupiable in a way that the beavers can form self-sustaining colonies there. And I think the big focus should be on improving those areas that are just on the edge of being suitable for beavers, so that they can move into those areas naturally. Because they do reproduce pretty quickly, they do disperse pretty far, and they will settle in a lot of different habitat conditions. So I definitely think it could contribute. I don't think it's the big thing to focus on. I think it's really encouraging beavers to move into the areas of their former range. I think that's where the big bulk of potential restoration is.
Thanks, Tori. It looks like Madison has put a few resources into the chat. We will make sure to share those out with everybody at the end. But I did see one final question here at the bottom. It says, and this is for both of you, are you two familiar with Castro and Thorne's stream evolution triangle? It really does a nice job of illustrating how biology, beavers, plants, etc., isn't just an outcome of hydrology, geomorphology, but often a key driver. This varies by context and stream type, which fits your narrative about the relative importance of these drivers, depending where you are. And then he gave a link to that. So, Jeremy, I wasn't sure if there was a specific question you wanted to ask in there, or if it was just more sharing information. So, thank you.
Yeah, mainly just sharing that and seeing if that was on your radar. It sounds a lot like what you're pointing out here, which is that context matters. And I think just in my pea brain of trying to piece together how all this works, this model was really helpful because, I'm a biologist and I always think about, or always did think about wildlife being a product of habitat. But there are certain species like beaver that are actually part of building that ecosystem. And so I think it just blew my mind in thinking about that, not just as an outcome of the habitat, but actually as a just as important as hydrology and geomorphology and stream form. But that varies, right? So when you're saying, in this V-shaped canyon, beavers aren't going to be the driving factor shaping that stream type. And so I think most people will understand that when they walk out on the landscape. And I really appreciated your ability to help them articulate that, read the beaverscape, and maybe help target these restoration actions where beavers are more likely to influence stream form. Thanks.
Thank you for all our really great questions today, and thank you to our presenters. And I think I'll turn it back over to Madison to sort of end up, but thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Sierra. And I'll just echo, a huge thank you to Becca and Tori, and of course, Sierra and Sarah for coordinating and presenting during today's seminar. And a big thank you to everyone who joined us today for part 2 of this. We had a great turnout. So I, just as a kind of a closing off message, I did post the link to where you can find this video, or we'll be able to find the recording of this seminar on the IOE website. So it's montanaioe.org/medias/videos. And I hope to have that uploaded by the end of today. And otherwise, I think we can call it. We're right at 1. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Madison. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks Madison and everybody else for organizing this, Sierra and Sarah.